The autumn sun was setting over downtown Millbrook when Officer David Harrison spotted something that made his jaw clench. A tall black man walked down Main Street wearing what looked like a military dress jacket covered in medals and patches. David had been a cop for 15 years, and in his mind, something didn't add up about this picture. David pulled his patrol car to the curb and stepped out. The man walking ahead didn't look like any veteran David knew. He was too well dressed, too confident, too different in David's experience. Real veterans didn't parade around town showing off their service like that. This had to be one of those stolen Valor cases he'd heard about. The man David was watching was actually Robert Johnson, a 34-year-old former Army sergeant who had just left a veterans memorial service at the community center. Robert had worn his dress uniform to honor fallen soldiers, something he did every year on this date. The medals on his chest weren't for show. Each one represented months of service in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. "Excuse me," David called out, his voice carrying the authority he'd built up over years of police work. "I need to speak with you?" Robert turned around, his face showing mild confusion but no alarm. He was used to people stopping him to thank him for his service when he wore his uniform. "Yes, officer? How can I help you?" David's eyes immediately went to the medals. Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Combat Infantry Badge, impressive decorations. That made David's suspicion grow stronger. In his mind, there was no way this man had earned all of these honors. Something about the whole situation felt wrong to him. "Where did you get that uniform?" David asked, stepping closer. His hand rested casually on his belt near his radio. "Those are some pretty serious medals you're wearing there." Robert's eyebrows raised slightly. This wasn't the conversation he'd expected. "I earned them during my service in Afghanistan, officer. Is there a problem?" "Afghanistan, huh?" David's voice carried clear doubt. "What unit were you with? When did you serve?" "And I'm going to need to see some identification." The question hit Robert like a cold wind. In all his years since coming home from war, he'd never had his service questioned like this. Other veterans sometimes shared stories about their service. People at the grocery store thanked him. But no one had ever demanded proof that he'd earned the right to wear his own uniform. "Officer, I served with the 10th Mountain Division from 2018 to 2021, Robert said calmly. "I have my military ID in my wallet if you'd like to see it." David's expression hardened. The man sounded confident, but David had dealt with con artists before. They always had their stories ready. A lot of people claim military service these days. Stolen valor is a federal crime, you know that? Impersonating a veteran can get you serious jail time. A small crowd began to gather on the sidewalk. People coming out of nearby shops and restaurants noticed the confrontation. Some pulled out their phones, sensing that something significant was happening. Robert felt the weight of their stares and tried to keep his voice steady. "Sir, I'm not impersonating anyone. I'm a veteran. If you'll just let me show you my identification, we can clear this up quickly." But David was already convinced he'd caught someone red-handed. In his experience, real veterans didn't need to prove anything to anyone. They certainly didn't wear their dress uniforms around town like costumes. The whole thing screamed fake to him. "Keep your hands where I can see them," David ordered, his voice rising. "Don't reach for anything without my permission." Robert felt his heart rate increase. This simple evening walk was turning into something much more serious. Around them, more people stopped to watch. He could hear murmurs from the crowd, some expressing concern, others seeming to support the officer's actions. "Officer, there seems to be a misunderstanding here," Robert said, keeping his hands visible at his sides. "I was just walking home from a memorial service. I wear this uniform to honor my fallen brothers. I have all my paperwork if you'd like to verify my service." David looked at the growing crowd and felt the pressure to act decisively. In his mind, backing down now would make him look weak. Either this man was a legitimate veteran, which David strongly doubted, or he was a criminal, trying to steal honor that belonged to real heroes. "The problem is that people like you think you can just put on a uniform and pretend to be something you're not," David said, his voice carrying across the street. Real veterans don't need to walk around advertising their service. The words hit Robert harder than any physical blow could have. After 3 tours in Afghanistan, after watching friends die, after carrying wounded soldiers to safety under enemy fire, he was being told he wasn't a real veteran. The absurdity of it would have been funny if it weren't so painful. Sir, I understand your concern about stolen valor. It's a real problem that hurts actual veterans, Robert said, his military training helping him stay calm under pressure. But I am asking you respectfully to check my credentials before making any assumptions. An older woman in the crowd called out, "Let the man show his ID, officer." Others began to voice similar sentiments, but David felt cornered now. He'd made his position clear, and changing course would mean admitting he might be wrong. "I've seen enough fake documents to know they don't prove anything," David replied, though he hadn't actually seen any documents yet. "Real military records take time to verify properly." Robert realized this situation was spiraling beyond a simple misunderstanding. The officer seemed determined to believe he was lying, regardless of what evidence might prove otherwise. The crowd was getting larger, and phones were recording everything. What should have been a peaceful evening was becoming a public spectacle. "Officer, I respect your duty to investigate potential crimes," Robert said, choosing his words carefully. "I'm willing to cooperate fully with any verification process you need to do. I just ask that you treat me with the same respect you'd show any other citizen." David heard the words but couldn't get past his initial assumption. Everything about this situation confirmed his suspicions. The confident way the man spoke, the perfect condition of the uniform, the collection of high-level medals, it all seemed too convenient, too much like someone playing a role. "We'll see about that respect once we sort out whether you've committed a federal crime," David said, reaching for his handcuffs. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." The crowd's murmur grew louder. Several people called out objections, but David was committed to his course of action now. In his mind, he was protecting the honor of real veterans by exposing this imposter. He couldn't see that his own assumptions and prejudices had led him to this moment. Robert felt the cold metal of handcuffs being placed around his wrists and closed his eyes for a moment. Somewhere in Afghanistan, he'd imagined coming home to a grateful nation. He'd never imagined this. The click of handcuffs echoed down Main Street as Officer David Harrison placed Robert Johnson under arrest. The crowd that had gathered was now openly vocal, with several people recording the scene on their phones. Robert stood with his back straight, even with his hands cuffed behind him, maintaining the military bearing that had been drilled into him years ago. "You're under arrest for suspected stolen valor," David announced loud enough for the crowd to hear. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Robert listened to his rights being read and felt a strange disconnect from reality. Less than an hour ago, he'd been sitting in a memorial service, remembering friends who hadn't made it home from war. Now he was being arrested for supposedly pretending to be the very thing he'd risk his life to become. "Officer, please," Robert said as David guided him toward the patrol car. "Just call the Veteran Affairs office. They can verify my service in minutes. This is all unnecessary." David opened the back door of his patrol car, but before putting Robert inside, he decided to make his case to the watching crowd. In his mind, these people needed to understand what stolen valor really meant and why it mattered so much. "Folks, what you're seeing here is exactly why we need to crack down on stolen valor," David said, his voice carrying the authority of his badge. "Real veterans earn their medals through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. When people fake military service, they're stealing honor that belongs to genuine heroes." An elderly man in the crowd stepped forward. He was wearing a Vietnam veteran's cap and looked angry. "Officer, how do you know this man didn't serve? Did you even check his identification?" David felt defensive. "Sir, I've been doing this job for 15 years. I know suspicious behavior when I see it. Real veterans don't parade around town in dress uniforms covered in medals." "That's exactly what we do during memorial services," the Vietnam veteran shot back. "I wear my dress blues every Veterans Day. Are you going to arrest me too?" The crowd murmured agreement, and David realized he was losing control of the narrative. He needed to get Robert to the station where he could sort this out properly, away from all these witnesses and cameras. Robert spoke up from beside the patrol car. "Sir, thank you for your service," he said to the Vietnam veteran. "Officer Harrison, I understand you're trying to protect military honor. I respect that. But I'm asking you to verify my service before this goes any further." David felt the weight of all those eyes on him, the phones recording, the questions being asked. He'd committed to this course of action, and backing down now would make him look incompetent. In his mind, he was still certain he'd caught someone faking military service, despite the growing doubt from the crowd. "We'll verify everything at the station," David said, guiding Robert into the back seat of the patrol car. That's where proper investigations happen, not on street corners. As David shut the car door, he heard someone in the crowd shout, "This is wrong," another voice called out. "Check his ID first." But David was already walking around to the driver's side, trying to ignore the growing chorus of objections inside the patrol car. Robert sat quietly and tried to process what was happening. The handcuffs were tight, cutting into his wrists. Slightly, the plastic seat was uncomfortable, designed more for containing people than for their comfort. He'd been in worse situations during his military service, but this felt different. This felt personal. David got into the driver's seat and started the engine. Through the rearview mirror, he looked at Robert, still searching for some sign that would confirm his suspicions. The man looked calm, almost resigned. David had expected more anger, more protest from someone who'd been caught in a lie. "You want to tell me the truth before we get to the station?" David asked as they pulled away from the curb. "Make this easier on yourself?" Robert met David's eyes in the mirror. "Officer Harrison, I've been telling you the truth from the beginning. I served 3 tours in Afghanistan with the 10th Mountain Division. I was wounded in action and medically retired. I wear this uniform to honor fallen soldiers, just like thousands of other veterans do across the country." David shook his head. "That's a good story, very detailed. But stories are easy to make up. Documents can be faked. What I need is real proof." "Then let's get that proof," Robert said simply. "Call the Department of Veterans Affairs. Call the Pentagon. Call my former commanding officer. I'll give you all the contact information you need." The confidence in Robert's voice gave David a moment of pause. Most people he arrested were either angry, scared, or trying to bargain their way out of trouble. Robert seemed genuinely willing to have his story investigated. But David pushed the doubt away. Con artists were often confident. That's what made them good at what they did. They drove through downtown in silence for a few minutes. David radioed ahead to the station, informing them he was bringing in a stolen Valor suspect. Robert watched the familiar streets pass by and thought about how different everything looked from the back of a police car. "Can I ask you something, officer?" Robert said as they stopped at a red light. "What? Have you ever served in the military?" David's jaw tightened. It was a sensitive subject for him. He'd considered joining the Army after high school, but had decided on law enforcement instead. Sometimes he wondered if he'd made the right choice, especially when he met veterans who seemed to command instant respect just for having served. "No, I haven't served," David admitted. "But I respect those who have. That's exactly why I take stolen valor so seriously." Robert nodded slowly. "I understand that. Military service means a lot to those of us who've done it. But it also means a lot to our families, our communities, and people like you who support us. That's why false accusations hurt just as much as stolen valor itself." David felt something uncomfortable in his chest when Robert said that. The man's tone wasn't accusatory or angry. It was almost understanding, like he was trying to explain something rather than defend himself. "Look," David said, turning into the police station parking lot, "if you really are a veteran, then this will all get sorted out. But if you're lying, if you're wearing medals you didn't earn, then you're going to face serious consequences." "I understand," Robert replied. "And I hope that when this is sorted out, you'll understand why wearing this uniform means so much to me As they pulled up to the station, David saw several other officers waiting outside. Word had apparently spread about the arrest. Some looked curious, others seemed skeptical. David realized that his handling of this case was going to be watched closely by his colleagues. He got out of the car and opened Robert's door. As Robert stepped out, still handcuffed, one of the other officers, Detective Lisa Chun, approached them. "David, what's the story here?" she asked, looking between the two men. "Suspected stolen Valor," David replied. "Found him walking downtown in full dress uniform, covered in medals. Claims to be an Afghanistan veteran." Detective Chun looked at Robert's uniform more closely. Unlike David, she'd worked several real stolen Valor cases and knew what to look for. Something about this didn't fit the usual pattern. "Did you verify his credentials?" she asked David. "We're going to do that inside," David said, feeling defensive again. "Proper investigation takes time." As they walked toward the station entrance, Robert spoke quietly to Detective Chun. "Ma'am, I have all my military documentation with me. I'm happy to provide whatever verification you need." Detective Chun nodded and made a mental note to review those documents carefully. She'd seen enough cases to know that real stolen Valor suspects usually avoided providing documentation. Not volunteered it eagerly, the automatic doors of the Millbrook police station opened, and Robert walked inside still wearing his dress uniform, still carrying himself with military bearing, and still believing that truth would win out in the end. Behind him, David followed, still convinced he'd caught a criminal, but beginning to feel the first small seeds of doubt. The Millbrook police station buzzed with quiet activity as Officer David Harrison led Robert Johnson to the processing area. The fluorescent lights made everything look harsh and cold, a stark contrast to the warm autumn evening outside. Robert had never been inside a police station as anything other than a visitor, and the experience felt surreal. Detective Lisa Chun followed them to the booking area, her curiosity growing by the minute. She'd worked dozens of cases involving false claims and fraud, and something about this situation didn't match the usual patterns. Most people caught in lies became defensive and evasive. Robert seemed calm and cooperative, almost eager to prove his claims. "All right," David said, removing Robert's handcuffs. "Let's see this identification you keep talking about." Robert rubbed his wrists where the metal had left red marks and reached slowly for his wallet. "I'm going to take out my military ID and discharge papers," he said, making sure his movements were clear and non-threatening. Everything should be in order. David watched skeptically as Robert pulled out a laminated military identification card. The photo matched, the dates looked reasonable, and the official seals appeared genuine. But David had convinced himself that skilled forgers could fake anything these days. "This could be fake," David said, holding the ID up to the light. "These days people can make documents that look real enough to fool anyone." Detective Chun stepped closer and examined the ID herself. Unlike David, she'd received training in document verification. The security features looked legitimate, the right kind of hologram, proper font spacing, and embedded security strips that would be extremely difficult to counterfeit. "David, this looks authentic to me," she said quietly. "What made you suspicious in the first place?" David felt defensive under her questioning gaze. He was walking around downtown in full dress uniform, covered in high-level medals. Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Combat Infantry, Badge, the works. It just seemed like too much, you know? Like someone playing dress-up? Robert overheard and spoke. "Officer, I understand why that might seem unusual. I only wear my dress uniform for special occasions, memorial services, Veterans Day, funerals for fallen soldiers. Today was the annual memorial for my unit." Detective Chun's eyebrows raised. "Which unit?" "3rd Brigade Combat Team, 10th Mountain Division," Robert replied without hesitation. "We called ourselves the Spartans. Lost 12 men during my 3 tours, including my best friend Tommy Martinez." The specific details and the genuine emotion in Robert's voice made Detective Chun exchange a glance with David. In her experience, people making up military service usually kept their stories vague to avoid being caught in lies. Robert was providing Very specific information that could easily be verified. David, however, remained skeptical. Anyone can look up unit names and memorize facts. The internet is full of military information. You're absolutely right, Robert agreed. That's why I carry documentation and why I'm happy to have my service verified through official channels. He pulled out additional papers from his wallet, discharge forms, medical records, and a worn photograph of soldiers in combat gear. The photo showed Robert in desert camouflage, standing with his arm around another soldier in what looked like an Afghan village. Detective Chun studied the photograph. The man in the picture was clearly Robert, but younger and thinner. His face had the hard edge that came from months in a combat zone. It was the kind of photo that would be nearly impossible to fake convincingly. "Officer Harrison," she said, "I think we should verify this information before proceeding further." David felt cornered. His entire case was built on his initial assumption, and now both the suspect and his colleague were questioning his judgment. But he committed to this course of action, and backing down would mean admitting he'd been wrong from the beginning. "Fine," David said, reaching for the phone. "Let's call the military verification hotline. But don't be surprised when we find out these documents are fraudulent." Robert sat quietly while David dialed the number for military records verification. The process was routine: provide the suspect's full name, social security number, and service dates, then wait for confirmation. David expected to hear that no such person had served in the military. "Yes, this is Officer Harrison with Millbrook Police Department," David said into the phone. "I need to verify military service for a Robert Johnson, born April 15, 1990, Robert provided his social security number and other details. The clerk on the other end of the line put David on hold while she accessed the records. David drummed his fingers on the desk, still confident that the whole elaborate story would fall apart under official scrutiny. Detective Chun used the waiting time to examine Robert's discharge papers more closely. The documents looked genuine, with official seals and signatures that would be extremely difficult to forge. More importantly, they told a story that matched everything Robert had said about his service. "Officer," Robert said quietly while they waited, "can I ask what specifically made you think I was lying? I mean, besides just seeing me in uniform?" David looked up from the phone, still on hold. The question caught him off guard because he realized his answer might not sound as reasonable as he'd thought. You didn't look like the veterans I know." "What do veterans look like?" Robert asked, genuinely curious. It was a simple question, but it made David uncomfortable. When he really thought about it, he realized his mental image of veterans was based more on movies and stereotypes than on reality. The veterans he knew personally came in all shapes, sizes, and colors. There was no one way a veteran was supposed to look. Before David could answer, the clerk came back on the line. "Officer Harrison, I have the records for Robert Johnson." David straightened up, ready to hear confirmation that the man was a fraud. "Go ahead." Sergeant Johnson served with the 10th Mountain Division from 2018 to 2021, 3 combat deployments to Afghanistan. He was awarded the Bronze Star for Valor in combat, the Purple Heart for wounds received in action, and the Combat Infantry Badge. He was medically retired following injuries sustained during his final deployment. David felt the floor shift under his feet. Every detail matched exactly what Robert had claimed. The clerk continued reading from the official record, confirming dates, units, and awards that painted a picture of distinguished military service. "Are you sure?" David asked, his voice weaker than before. "Robert Johnson, born April 15, 1990? "That's correct, officer. His record shows exemplary service under combat conditions." "Is there anything specific you need to verify?" David looked across the desk at Robert, who sat quietly with no expression of triumph or vindication. Just patience and understanding. The weight of what had just happened began to settle on David's shoulders. "No," David said into the phone. "That answers my questions. Thank you." He hung up and sat in silence for a moment. Detective Chun looked between the two men, realizing that something significant had just happened. The evidence was clear, the official verification was complete, and yet David looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. Officer Harrison, Robert said gently, I know this isn't easy. Making assumptions about people is human nature. The important thing is what we do when we learn we've been wrong. David stared at the documents spread across his desk. Genuine military ID, authentic discharge papers, official verification of distinguished service. Everything he'd been so certain was fake turned out to be completely real. The man he'd arrested as a fraud was exactly who he claimed to be, a decorated combat veteran who'd risked his life for his country. Detective Chun broke the silence. David, I think we need to discuss how to handle this situation. But David was still processing the magnitude of his mistake. He'd publicly arrested and humiliated a genuine war hero based on nothing more than his own prejudices and assumptions. The realization hit him like a physical blow, and for the first time since putting on a police uniform, he wondered if he was really cut out for this job. Robert watched the emotions play across David's face and felt a familiar sadness. He'd hoped that coming home from war would mean an end to being judged by his appearance rather than his character. But sitting in this police station, still wearing the uniform he'd earned through blood and sacrifice, he realized that some battles followed you home. The silence in the police station processing room stretched on like a held breath. Officer David Harrison stared at the phone he'd just hung up, the military verification clerk's words echoing in his mind. Decorated veteran. Bronze Star for Valor. Purple Heart for wounds received in action. Every single detail that Robert Johnson had provided checked out perfectly. Detective Lisa Shun cleared her throat, breaking the uncomfortable quiet. David, we need to call the military liaison officer. This situation has gotten complicated. David nodded numbly, still trying to process what had just happened. His 15 years of police experience had taught him to trust his instincts, but those same instincts had just led him to arrest a genuine war hero. The confidence he'd felt an hour ago had completely evaporated. Robert sat patiently, his military bearings still intact despite everything that had happened. He'd been handcuffed, arrested, and accused of stealing honor he'd literally bled for. But his expression remained calm and understanding. If anything, he seemed concerned about David's obvious distress. Officer Harrison, Robert said quietly, I know this is difficult. Would it help if I explained a bit more about my service? Sometimes understanding the full picture makes things clearer. David looked up, surprised by the offer. Most people in Robert's situation would be demanding apologies and threatening lawsuits. Instead, this man was offering to help him understand. What had gone wrong? Before David could respond, Detective Chun's phone rang. That'll be Captain Williams, she said, answering the call. Yes, sir, yes, we have the situation under control. Actually, there's been a development. She stepped away to brief the captain on what had transpired, leaving David and Robert alone in the processing area. The awkwardness was thick enough to cut with a knife, but Robert seemed determined to bridge the gap. Officer, can I tell you about the Bronze Star? Robert asked. Not to make you feel worse, but because I think it might help you understand why this uniform means so much to me. David found himself nodding, drawn in despite his embarrassment. It was my second tour in Afghanistan, Robert began, his voice taking on a distant quality. We were on patrol in a village outside Kandahar when our convoy hit an IED. The explosion flipped our lead vehicle and trapped 3 of my soldiers inside. Robert's hands, which had been steady throughout the entire arrest process, began to shake slightly as he recalled the memory. The vehicle was on fire, and we could hear enemy gunfire from the surrounding buildings. Everyone else was taking cover, which was the smart tactical move, but I could hear my guys screaming from inside that truck. David found himself leaning forward, caught up in the story, despite himself. I ran through enemy fire to reach the vehicle. Tommy Martinez was unconscious, and Jake Williams had a broken leg. The youngest guy, Kevin Brown, was just 19 years old and crying for his mother. The fuel tank was leaking, and I knew the whole thing could explode any second. Robert paused, gathering himself before continuing. I pulled all 3 of them out one by one, carrying them to safety while taking fire from insurgents in the surrounding buildings. Kevin died 2 days later from internal injuries, but Tommy and Jake made it home to their families. David felt something heavy settle in his chest. This wasn't just a story. He could see the weight of those memories in Robert's eyes, the way his voice changed when he mentioned the soldier who didn't make it home. "The Bronze Star wasn't for me," Robert continued. "It was for Kevin, Tommy. And Jake, it was for every soldier who trusted me to lead them and bring them home safely. When I wear these medals, I'm not showing off, I'm remembering." Detective Chun returned from her phone call, her expression serious. "The military liaison officer is on her way. Captain Williams wants a full report on what happened here tonight." David nodded but kept his attention focused on Robert. "What about the Purple Heart?" Robert's hand unconsciously moved to his left shoulder. "Same engagement. I took shrapnel from a mortar round while providing cover for the medical evacuation. Helicopter. Spent 6 weeks in a military hospital in Germany before they cleared me to return to duty." "But you went back?" David asked, surprised. "My unit was still over there," Robert said simply. "My soldiers needed their sergeant. I wasn't going to abandon them because of some metal fragments in my shoulder." The weight of Robert's service record was becoming clear to David. This wasn't someone playing dress up or seeking attention. This was a man who had repeatedly put his life on the line for others, who had earned every ribbon and medal through sacrifice and valor. "Officer Harrison," Robert said, "I need you to understand something." "What happened tonight?" being questioned. "About my service. Being accused of lying about the most important thing I've ever done. It hurts more than those shrapnel wounds ever did." David felt the words like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on protecting military honor that he'd never considered how his accusations might wound a real veteran. Before he could respond, the station's front doors opened and a woman in military dress uniform walked in. Staff Sergeant Patricia Williams, the regional military liaison officer, had arrived to assess the situation. "Where's the alleged stolen valor case?" she asked Detective Chun. "Right here," Chun replied, gesturing toward Robert. "Though I think there's been a significant misunderstanding." Staff Sergeant Williams took one look at Robert in his dress uniform, and her expression changed immediately. She walked over and examined his ribbons and medals with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent 20 years in the military. "Sergeant Johnson?" she said, her voice filled with recognition. "Is that really you?" Robert stood up, his military bearing automatic in the presence of a superior non-commissioned officer. "Yes, ma'am. Good to see you, Sergeant Williams." David watched in confusion as the two veterans embraced warmly. Clearly, they knew each other, but he didn't understand the connection. "Officer," Staff Sergeant Williams said, turning to face David, "I need to explain something to you. Sergeant Johnson isn't just any veteran. He's one of the most decorated soldiers from the recent Afghanistan campaigns." She gestured to Robert's uniform. "Every medal you see there was earned through extraordinary service under combat conditions. The Bronze Star for valor in rescuing wounded soldiers under enemy fire. The Purple Heart for wounds received in action. The Combat Infantry Badge for service in direct ground combat." David felt his mistake growing larger with every word. "But more than that," Williams continued, "Sergeant Johnson has spent the last 2 years working with our veteran transition programs, helping other former soldiers adjust to civilian life. He's personally counseled over 100 veterans dealing with combat trauma and adjustment issues." She looked between David and Robert, clearly trying to understand what had happened. "So when I got a call about a stolen valor case involving Robert Johnson, I knew there had to be some kind of mistake. This man doesn't just respect military honor, he embodies it." David felt like the room was spinning. Not only had he arrested an innocent man, but he'd arrested someone who was actively working to help other veterans. The irony was crushing in his attempt to protect military honor. He'd attacked one of its finest representatives. Robert stepped forward. "Sergeant Williams." Officer Harrison was doing his job. "Stolen valor is a real problem, and he was trying to protect the integrity of military service. I respect that, even if his approach was misguided." Even now, facing the person who could corroborate his entire story, Robert was defending the man who had wrongly arrested him. The grace he showed in that moment hit David harder than any criticism could have. Staff Sergeant Williams studied David's face, seeing the realization and regret written there. Officer Harrison, I think we need to have a serious conversation about how this happened and how we can prevent it from happening again. Staff Sergeant Patricia Williams opened her laptop on Detective Chun's desk and pulled up Robert Johnson's complete military service record. What she showed Officer David Harrison painted a picture of heroism that went far beyond anything David had imagined possible. Officer Harrison, I want you to see exactly who you arrested tonight, Williams said, turning the screen so David could read the official documents. Sergeant Johnson didn't just serve 3 tours in Afghanistan. He volunteered for his 3rd deployment after his unit was decimated by casualties. David stared at the screen, reading citation after citation for bravery under fire. Each entry told a story of a soldier who consistently put others before himself, who led from the front, and who never backed down from danger when his troops were at risk. Look at this entry from October 2020, Williams said, pointing to a specific incident report. Sergeant Johnson's patrol was ambushed in the Khyber province. Instead of calling for backup and waiting, he led a counterattack that saved 2 wounded Afghan interpreters who were trapped in the kill zone. Robert stood quietly in the corner, uncomfortable with having his service records discussed in detail. He'd never been comfortable with praise, preferring to focus on the soldiers who hadn't made it home rather than his own actions. Detective Chun read over David's shoulder, shaking her head in amazement. This reads like something out of a war movie. How many times did you put yourself in harm's way to save others? I did what any good sergeant would do, Robert replied. You take care of your soldiers, that's the job? Williams scrolled to another section of the file. Officer Harrison, I want you to see something specific. This incident report from March 2021, it's the action that earned Sergeant Johnson his Bronze Star. The detailed report described the I'd attack Robert had mentioned earlier, but with far more specificity than his modest retelling had included. According to the official account, Robert had not only rescued 3 soldiers from a burning vehicle, but had done so while coordinating a defense against a complex enemy attack involving multiple insurgent positions. The citation specifically mentions that Sergeant Johnson's actions under fire prevented what could have been a company-level disaster, Williams explained. His quick thinking and personal courage saved not just 3 lives, but potentially dozens more. David read the words on the screen but struggled to reconcile them with his earlier assumptions. The man he'd arrested as a fake had actually performed acts of heroism that most people could barely imagine, let alone accomplish. Williams clicked to another document. And here's something that makes this situation even more significant. After his medical retirement, Sergeant Johnson was recruited for our peer counseling program specifically because of his leadership abilities and his understanding of combat trauma. She turned to look at Robert, who seemed uncomfortable with the attention. How many veterans have you helped transition back to civilian life? Numbers don't matter, Robert said quietly. What matters is that guys who serve their country get the support they need when they come home. The number is 127, Williams said to David. Sergeant Johnson has personally counseled 127 veterans dealing with various transition issues. PTSD, job placement, family problems, substance abuse, he's helped them all. David felt physically sick. Not only had he wrongly arrested a war hero, but he'd arrested someone who spent his civilian time helping other veterans. The irony was so thick he could barely breathe. Williams pulled up a photo file that made David's heart sink even further. The images showed Robert in various settings, speaking at veteran events, working with homeless former soldiers, visiting wounded warriors in military hospitals. In every photo, he was clearly respected and admired by the military community. Officer Harrison, Williams said, I need you to understand something. In the veteran community, Robert Johnson is what we call a soldier's soldier. He's the kind of leader that other soldiers look up to, the kind of man they trust with their lives. She clicked to a group photo showing Robert with about 20 other veterans at what looked like a barbecue or picnic. This was taken last month at a reunion for his unit. Every man in this photo served under Sergeant Johnson's leadership in Afghanistan. Every one of them credits him with keeping them alive. Robert shifted uncomfortably. Sergeant Williams, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but Officer Harrison made an honest mistake. There's no need to embarrass him further. Even after everything that had happened, Robert was still trying to protect David's feelings. The grace he was showing made David feel even worse about his actions. Williams wasn't finished. She pulled up another document that made David's blood run cold. Officer Harrison, do you remember the helicopter crash outside Kandahar in January? 2021. It was in the news, 6 soldiers killed when their Black Hawk went down during a medical evacuation mission. David nodded. He remembered the story. It had been a tragic end to what should have been a routine mission. What wasn't in the news, Williams continued, was that Sergeant Johnson and his team were providing ground security for that landing zone. When the helicopter crashed, he led the rescue effort that pulled 2 surviving crew members from the wreckage. She showed David photos from the incident, grainy images that captured Robert and other soldiers working frantically to extract survivors from twisted metal and flames. One of those survivors was Corporal Mike Thompson from right here in Millbrook. He's married to a local teacher, has 2 kids, coaches Little League Baseball. He's alive today because Robert Johnson refused to give up on him. David's heart stopped. Mike Thompson, he knew Mike Thompson. The man coached his nephew's baseball team. David had talked to Mike dozens of times at community events, never knowing how close he'd come to never making it home from Afghanistan. Mike lives about 6 blocks from where you arrested Sergeant Johnson tonight, William said quietly. He's probably at home right now, helping his kids with homework, because this man risked his life to pull him from a burning helicopter? The room fell silent as the full weight of David's mistake settled on everyone present. He hadn't just arrested an innocent man, he'd arrested the man who had saved the life of someone David knew personally. Someone whose children played with his own nephew, Robert spoke up from the corner. Officer Harrison, I can see you're struggling with this, but I want you to know that I don't hold any anger toward you. You were trying to protect something important, the honor of military service. That's admirable, even if your methods were wrong. David looked up at Robert, seeing him clearly for the first time all evening. This wasn't just a man in a uniform. This was a genuine hero who had spent years risking his life for others and who continued to serve his fellow veterans even after his military career had ended. I want to show you one more thing, William said, pulling up a final document. This is a letter of recommendation that Sergeant Johnson wrote for a young veteran who was struggling to find work. It's typical of the dozens he's written over the past 2 years. David read the letter, which was written with obvious care and attention to detail. Robert had taken the time to highlight the young veteran's strengths, to explain his military experience in terms that civilian employers would understand, and to personally vouch for his character and work ethic. That young man got the job, William said. He's now supporting his family and doing well, thanks in large part to Sergeant Johnson's advocacy. David closed his eyes and tried to process everything he'd learned. The man he'd arrested as a fraud was actually one of the most decorated and respected veterans of his generation. Someone who continued to serve others even after his military career had ended. Someone who had personally saved the life of David's neighbor. The magnitude of his mistake was overwhelming. But even worse was the realization of what had driven that mistake in the first place. His assumptions hadn't been based on evidence or facts. They'd been based on prejudice, on stereotypes, on a worldview that allowed him to see a distinguished veteran and immediately assume he was lying. Sergeant Johnson, David said, his voice barely above a whisper, I owe you an apology. That I don't even know how to begin? Officer David Harrison sat alone in his patrol car outside the Millbrook police station, staring at his hands on the steering wheel. Staff Sergeant Williams had left with Robert after completing the paperwork to officially clear him of all charges. Detective Chun had gone home after filing her report. The night shift had taken over, and David was supposed to be off duty, but he couldn't bring himself to drive home yet. The weight of what had happened pressed down on him like a physical force. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Robert's face. Calm, dignified, understanding even while being handcuffed and accused of crimes he'd never committed. The contrast between Robert's grace and David's own actions made him feel sick to his stomach. His radio crackled with routine calls, a domestic. Disturbance on Oak Street, a noise complaint from the college district, a fender bender near the highway. Normal police work that seemed impossibly distant from the reality he was now facing. How was he supposed to go back to regular patrol duties after what he'd learned about himself tonight? David pulled out his phone and scrolled through the photos that Staff Sergeant Williams had shown him. She'd emailed copies of Robert's service record, not as evidence for any case, but as an educational tool. Each image told a story of courage, sacrifice, and dedication that made David's accusations seem not just wrong, but cruel. There was a photo of Robert receiving his Bronze Star, standing at attention while a general pinned the medal to his chest. Another showed him in a military hospital, visiting wounded soldiers with that same patient expression David had seen earlier tonight. A third captured him speaking at a veteran's funeral, comforting a widow whose husband hadn't made it home from war, but it was the last photo that hit David the hardest. It showed Robert with Mike Thompson and Mike's 2 children at a Little League game, all of them smiling and relaxed. Mike had his arm around Robert's shoulders in the casual way of old friends while the kids were showing off their baseball gloves. David realized he'd probably driven past this exact scene dozens of times without knowing the story behind it. His phone buzzed with a text message from his partner, Officer Jennifer Santos. Heard about tonight, everything okay? David stared at the message for a long time before typing back. No, need to talk, Jennifer responded immediately. Coffee shop on Main Street. 20 minutes. 20 minutes later, David found himself sitting across from Jennifer at an all-night diner, nursing a cup of coffee he didn't want while trying to find words for what he was feeling. Jennifer had been his partner for 3 years, and she'd always been honest with him, sometimes brutally so. Tell me what happened, she said without preamble. David recounted the evening's events, starting with seeing Robert on Main Street and ending with the revelation of who he'd actually arrested. Jennifer listened without interruption, her expression growing more serious with each detail. David, she said when he finished, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. What made you think he was lying about? His service? It was the question David had been dreading because he knew the answer would reveal something ugly about himself. I don't know, something just seemed off. That's not an answer, Jennifer said firmly. You've been a cop for 15 years. You know the difference between evidence and assumptions. What specifically made you suspicious? David stared into his coffee cup, unable to meet her eyes. He was wearing a lot of medals, high-level decorations. It seemed like too much. David, look at me. Reluctantly, he raised his eyes to meet hers. Was it the medals, or was it the man wearing them? The question hung in the air between them like an accusation. David wanted to deny it, to find some other explanation for his actions, but Jennifer's steady gaze demanded honesty. I don't know, he said quietly. Yes, you do. You just don't want to say it out loud. David felt something break inside his chest. Maybe it was both. Jennifer nodded sadly. David, I've been watching you for 3 years. I've seen how you interact with people, how you make decisions about who to stop, who to question, who to trust. There's a pattern. What do you mean? I mean, you treat people differently based on what they look like. You give some people the benefit of the doubt and assume others are lying from the start. David wanted to argue, but the events of the evening had stripped away his ability to deny what was right in front of him. I'm not a racist, Jennifer. I don't hate anyone. I didn't say you were hateful, she replied. But bias doesn't require hate. It just requires assumptions about who belongs where and who deserves what. She leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. David, tonight you saw a black man in a military uniform covered in medals, and your first thought was that he was stealing honor that didn't belong to him. Why do you think that was your first thought? The question forced David to confront something he'd been avoiding for years. His assumptions hadn't been based on evidence or training or experience. They'd been based on unconscious beliefs about who was supposed to be a hero and who wasn't. "I've worked with you for 3 years," Jennifer continued, "and I've never seen you question a white person's credentials like that. Never seen you assume they were lying without any evidence." David felt the walls he'd built around his own self-image crumbling. "I'm a good cop. I've helped people. You've never used racial slurs or joined hate groups," Jennifer said. "But that doesn't mean you treat everyone equally." Tonight proved that. A group of teenagers walked past their window, laughing and joking on their way home from some late-night adventure. David watched them and wondered how many times he'd looked at similar groups and made assumptions about what they were up to based on nothing more than their appearance. "What am I supposed to do with this?" David asked. "How do I face Robert? How do I face Mike Thompson, knowing that I arrested the man who saved his life?" Jennifer was quiet for a moment. "You start by admitting that you were wrong. Not just about Robert's service record, but about the assumptions that led you to doubt him in the first place. And then what? Then you figure out how to do better. You get training, you examine your own biases, you work to earn back the trust you lost." Tonight, David's phone buzzed with another message. This one was from his supervisor, Captain Williams, asking him to come in early tomorrow for a meeting about the incident. David knew his career might be over, depending on how the department chose to handle what had happened. "Jennifer, what if I can't change? What if this is just who I am?" She reached across the table and put her hand on his arm. David, recognizing the problem, is the first step toward fixing it. Most people never get that far. They sat in silence for a while, watching. The late-night traffic passed by on Main Street. David thought about Robert, probably at home now, still processing the humiliation of being arrested for wearing medals he'd earned with his blood. He thought about the crowd that had gathered, the phones that had recorded everything, the story. That would probably be all over social media by morning. "I need to make this right," David said finally. "Yes, you do. But first, you need to understand exactly what went wrong and why. Otherwise, you'll just repeat the same mistakes with different people." David nodded, finally beginning to understand the magnitude of the work ahead of him. Tonight hadn't just been about one wrongful arrest. It had been a revelation of prejudices he'd carried for years without examining them, assumptions he'd made about people based on their appearance rather than their character. The coffee shop was nearly empty now, just a few night shift workers grabbing quick meals before heading to their jobs. David looked around at their faces, black, white, Hispanic, young, old, and realized he'd probably made assumptions about every one of them at some point. The thought made him feel sick. "Jennifer, how do I live with knowing I've been wrong about so many things for so long?" "The same way everyone does," she replied. "One day at a time, one decision at a time, one interaction at a time. You can't change the past, but you can change what happens next." 2 days after the arrest, Officer David Harrison found himself standing outside Robert Johnson's modest 2-story house on Elm Street. He'd been there for 10 minutes, working up the courage to knock on the door. His hands were sweating despite the cool autumn air, and his mouth felt dry as sandpaper. The house was exactly what David had expected, well-maintained but not flashy, with a small American flag hanging from the front porch and a garden that showed careful attention without being showy. A bicycle leaned against the side of the house, and David could see children's toys in the backyard. It looked like the home of someone who valued family and community over status symbols. David had spent the last 2 days in meetings with his supervisors, reviewing the incident and discussing his future with the department. Captain Williams had been clear that while no formal charges would be filed against David, his actions had damaged both his own credibility and the department's reputation in the community. The video of Robert's arrest had gone viral locally, and the police department was facing serious questions about racial profiling. But David wasn't here because of departmental pressure or public relations concerns. He was here because he couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't function normally while knowing what he'd done to an innocent man. The weight of his mistake pressed down on him every waking moment, And he knew that facing Robert was the only way to begin making things right. Finally, David forced himself to walk up the front steps and knock on the door. After a moment, he heard footsteps inside, and then the door opened to reveal Robert, dressed casually in jeans and a simple button-down shirt. For a moment, the two men just looked at each other. "Officer Harrison," Robert said, his voice neutral but not hostile. "I was wondering if you might come by." "I hope you don't mind me showing up unannounced," David said, his voice barely steady. "I needed to talk to you, and I didn't know how else to reach out." Robert stepped aside and gestured for David to come in. "Please, come in." "Can I get you some coffee or water?" The kindness in the offer almost broke David's composure. After everything that had happened, Robert was still treating him like a welcome guest rather than the man who had humiliated him publicly. They settled in Robert's living room, which was decorated with family photos and a few military mementos displayed tastefully on shelves. David noticed a folded American flag in a shadow box, probably from Robert's retirement ceremony, and several photos of Robert with other soldiers in various locations that looked like Afghanistan. "Robert," David began, then stopped, overwhelmed by the inadequacy of words. "I don't even know where to start. What I did to you was wrong on every level." Robert sat quietly, allowing David to find his words. "I've been a police officer for 15 years, David continued. "I thought I was good at my job. I thought I was fair and professional. But what I did to you showed me that I've been carrying around assumptions and prejudices that I didn't even realize I had." David's voice cracked slightly as he spoke. "You were walking home from a memorial service honoring fallen soldiers, and I saw you and immediately assumed you were a criminal. Not because of any evidence or suspicious behavior, but because of who you are and what you look like." Robert leaned forward slightly. "David, can I call you David? What you're describing is more common than you might think. Unconscious bias affects everyone, including good people who would never intentionally hurt someone." The fact that Robert was trying to help him understand rather than simply accept his apology made David feel even worse. "But I'm a police officer. I'm supposed to be better than that. I'm supposed to protect people, not attack them based on prejudices." "You're human," Robert said simply. "Humans make mistakes. What matters is what you do after you recognize the mistake." David looked around the room, taking in the photos of Robert with his family, his fellow soldiers, the community, members he'd helped through his veteran advocacy work. Every image showed a man who had spent his adult life serving others, first in the military and then as a civilian. "Can I ask you something?" David said. "How are you not angry with me? How are you sitting here being kind to me after what I put you through?" Robert was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "I've been angry, David. I've been hurt and confused and frustrated. Being accused of stealing Valor, being handcuffed in front of a crowd, having my service questioned, it was devastating." David felt each word like a physical blow. "But I've also seen what anger and resentment can do to people," Robert continued. "I've worked with veterans who came home from war carrying so much rage that it destroyed their relationships, their careers, their health. I learned that holding on to anger hurts me more than it hurts the person I'm angry at." Robert stood up and walked to the shadow box containing his folded flag. "This flag was presented to me when I retired from the Army. The officer who gave it to me said that my service had honored the ideals that flag represents: equality, justice, freedom for all people." He turned back to David. "If I let what happened the other night turn me bitter and resentful, then I'd be dishonoring those ideals myself. I'd be letting prejudice win, just in a different way." David felt tears welling up in his eyes. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." "Forgiveness isn't about what you deserve," Robert said, returning to his seat. "It's about what I choose to do with the hurt I'm carrying. I can let it turn into hatred, or I can use it as motivation to help make things better." They sat in silence for a few minutes. David tried to process Robert's words while Robert seemed content to let him work through his emotions without pressure. "Robert," David finally said, "I want to make this right somehow. I know I can't undo what happened, but I want to do something to show that I understand how wrong I was." Robert nodded thoughtfully. What did you have in mind? I don't know yet. Training, maybe? Community outreach? I've been thinking about asking for a transfer to a different department, starting over somewhere else. Running away won't solve the problem, Robert said gently. If you really want to make things right, you need to stay here and do the work where people can see it. David looked up, surprised by the suggestion. This community needs to see that police officers can acknowledge their mistakes and work to do better, Robert explained. If you transfer somewhere else, you're just taking your unconscious biases with you. But if you stay here and demonstrate real change, you might help other officers examine their own assumptions. The idea of staying and facing the consequences of his actions terrified David, but he could see the wisdom in Robert's words. Would you be willing to help me? David asked. Would you be willing to work with me on bias training or community programs or whatever it takes to make sure this doesn't happen again? Robert smiled for the first time since David had arrived. I'd be honored to work with you, David, but you need to understand that this isn't going to be easy. Confronting unconscious bias is hard work, and it's never really finished. I'm ready for hard work, David said, and for the first time in 2 days, he felt like he might be able to face himself in the mirror again. Robert extended his hand, and David shook it gratefully. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, that would take time and demonstrated change. But it was the beginning of something better, a partnership that could help heal both men and maybe even their community. As David prepared to leave, Robert walked him to the door. David, can I give you one piece of advice? Of course. Don't try to change everything at once. Start small, be consistent, and remember that the goal isn't to become perfect. The goal is to become better, one day at a time. David nodded, feeling more hopeful than he had since the night of the arrest. He had a long road ahead of him, but for the first time, he felt like he had a guide who could help him find his way. 6 months later, Officer David Harrison stood at the front of the Millbrook Police Academy training room, looking out at 24 new recruits who hung on his every word. Next to him stood Robert Johnson, no longer in his military dress uniform, but wearing a simple suit and tie that somehow conveyed just as much authority and respect. The hardest thing about being a police officer, David told the recruits, isn't dealing with dangerous criminals or life-threatening situations. The hardest thing is looking in the mirror and admitting when you've been wrong about something fundamental. The recruits listened intently. Most of them had heard the story of what had happened between David and Robert, though they were getting a much more detailed and honest version than the rumors that had circulated through the community. Robert stepped forward to address the group. 6 months ago, Officer Harrison arrested me for stolen valor. He was convinced I was lying about my military service, despite having no evidence beyond his own assumptions about what a veteran should look like. The room was absolutely silent. These young officers in training were learning about bias and prejudice not from textbooks or theoretical discussions, but from 2 men who had lived through the consequences of unchecked assumptions. I was angry, Robert continued. I was hurt and humiliated. But Officer Harrison did something that changed both of our lives. He acknowledged his mistake and committed to learning from it. David looked out at the eager faces before him. Some of them were probably carrying the same unconscious biases he'd held for years. His job now was to help them recognize those biases before they caused the kind of damage he'd inflicted. I want you to understand something, David said. I thought I was a good cop. I'd never used excessive force, never taken a bribe, never violated department policy in any obvious way. But I was still causing harm through my assumptions about people. He clicked to the next slide in their presentation, which showed statistics about racial disparities in police stops and arrests. These numbers don't lie. When officers rely on unconscious bias instead of evidence-based policing, we end up targeting people based on what they look like rather than what they've done. After the presentation, David and Robert answered questions from the recruits. The questions were thoughtful and sometimes uncomfortable, but both men appreciated the honest dialogue. Later that afternoon, David was back on patrol, but his approach to the job had changed dramatically. Where he once might have made quick judgments about people based on their appearance, he now forced himself to examine his assumptions before acting. It was exhausting mental work, but it was beginning to feel natural. His radio crackled with a call about a suspicious person in Memorial Park 6 months ago. David might have rushed to the scene expecting to find a troublemaker. Now he approached with curiosity rather than assumptions. The suspicious person turned out to be an elderly man feeding ducks with his granddaughter. A concerned citizen had called because the man looked out of place in the upscale neighborhood surrounding the park. David spent a few pleasant minutes talking with the grandfather and his granddaughter before explaining to the caller that feeding ducks wasn't actually suspicious behavior. It was a small interaction, but it represented the kind of change David was trying to make in his daily work. Instead of seeing threats where none existed, he was learning to see people as individuals with their own stories and reasons for being where they were. That evening, David attended his weekly bias training session, a program he'd voluntarily enrolled in after the incident with Robert. The group included police officers, teachers, social workers, and other community members who wanted to examine their own unconscious prejudices. This week, I want everyone to share an example of when you caught yourself making an assumption about someone, the facilitator said. David raised his hand. Yesterday, I stopped a teenager for riding his bike through a crosswalk instead of walking it. My first thought was that he was being disrespectful and ignoring traffic laws. But when I talked to him, I learned he was rushing to get home because his little sister was sick and his mom needed help. The group discussed how easy it was to create narratives about people's behavior without understanding their circumstances. David was learning that good policing required curiosity and empathy, not just authority and suspicion. After the training session, David drove to the community center where Robert was hosting his weekly support group for veterans. David had started attending these meetings not as a participant but as a volunteer who helped with setup and logistics. It was his way of giving back to the community he damaged through his actions. Tonight, the group was discussing the challenges of transitioning from military to civilian life. A young veteran named Carlos was struggling with employment, having been turned down for several jobs despite his impressive military record. "The problem isn't your qualifications," Robert told Carlos. "You're more than qualified for these positions. But sometimes employers have assumptions about veterans, that we're all damaged, that we can't handle stress, that we're too rigid for civilian work." David listened from the back of the room, recognizing the parallel to his own assumptions about Robert 6 months earlier. Bias didn't just affect police work, it infected every aspect of society, creating barriers for people who deserved better. After the meeting, Robert and David walked to their cars together. This had become a routine for them, these brief conversations. That helped both men process the work they were doing. "How did the academy training go today?" Robert asked. "Good, I think." The recruits asked hard questions. "Some of them are really thinking about these issues, which gives me hope." Robert nodded. 6 months ago, I wasn't sure if any good could come from what happened between us. But watching you work with those recruits, seeing how seriously you're taking this, it gives me hope too." They'd reached their cars, but neither man seemed ready to end the conversation. "Robert, can I ask you something I've been wondering about?" David said, "Of course. Do you think I'm really changing, or am I just going through the motions because I got caught?" Robert considered the question seriously. "David, the man who arrested me 6 months ago wouldn't have asked that question. He would have assumed he was fine and everyone else was the problem. The fact that you're constantly examining your own motivations tells me the change is real." David felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Self-doubt had been his constant companion since the arrest. But Robert's words carried the authority of someone who had seen real change happen in the most unlikely circumstances. 6 months later, David had become one of the department's go-to officers for community outreach and bias training. His story, both the mistake he'd made and the work he'd done to address it, had become a powerful tool for helping other officers examine their own assumptions. Robert had expanded his veteran advocacy work, partnering with the police department to create better support systems for veterans in crisis. Their collaboration had prevented several situations that could have escalated into dangerous confrontations between police and troubled veterans. The transformation hadn't been easy for either man. David still caught himself making assumptions sometimes, though he was getting better at recognizing and correcting them. Robert still felt the sting of that night's humiliation, but he channeled that pain into productive work that was helping his community. Their partnership had become a model for what was possible when people were willing to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and work together to create something better. It wasn't a perfect solution. Bias and prejudice were too deeply rooted in society for any single partnership to solve. But it was a beginning, a demonstration that change was possible when people chose courage over comfort. Standing in front of those police recruits, David often thought about how different his life might have been if he'd never met Robert Johnson. He probably would have continued in his old patterns, making assumptions and causing harm without ever realizing it. The arrest that had seemed like his biggest mistake had actually become his greatest opportunity for growth. Robert, for his part, had found a new sense of purpose in his work with David and the police department. The night that had begun with such pain and humiliation had ultimately led to changes that were making his community safer and more just for everyone. Neither man would have chosen the path that brought them together, but both had learned that sometimes the most meaningful relationships are forged in the aftermath of mistakes, when people choose to do the hard work of understanding and forgiveness rather than walking away from the damage they've caused.